Good afternoon. Welcome to the Big Show. The Big Show we do every single day. We try and talk a lot about things that go on in Pittsburgh sports. I'm Paul Zeise, obviously, with the Post-Gazette here. As you noticed this week, we're doing it not necessarily live, but we're doing it every day, mostly because of some scheduling things around vacations and all that other good stuff. So tune in, and we will all have a good time. We're going to talk a lot about the Steelers today, a little bit about the Pirates again. Also, might even get into a little bit of what's going on in the world of college football now that we are in the era of paid players. One thing that's interesting, today is the birth date of Art Rooney. And, one of the things about the beloved character that we know as the Chief is that I think that at times there's a little bit of this sort of need to whitewash his era as the owner. To be honest, Art Rooney was not a very good owner at all until he decided to put his son Dan in charge. And Dan obviously turned the football program around, turned the football team around. But obviously Art Rooney is beloved because of his, what he did with respect to charity, the fact that he was the Steelers owner when they finally turned it around. But it took him 40 years to do this. I mean, if you think about it, the Steelers were the laughing stock of football. Dan Rooney obviously was a very sharp, smart football mind, understood what needed to be done, listened to people like Bill Nunn, who, led him to where they were able to go out and find a lot of players in the black colleges and places where at that time nobody really was looking for them. So, I think that it should be noted that Art Rooney, it's his birthday and people are celebrating him as the Chief. But I always say until he put his son in charge of the football operation, I mean, he was not a very good owner. In fact, he was probably considered one of the worst owners in the league, as the Steelers were terrible for a long, long, long time. Once Dan Rooney got in charge, however, everything turned. And, of course, that led to the 70s, which there's a number of people out there in this world that want to believe that the Steelers franchise started really in 1970. They don't want to talk about the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. But in 1969, when they hired Chuck Noll, when they started to move forward as a franchise, and then they started doing things like scouting black colleges and scouting the South, and doing a lot of different things like that to make sure that they got better. Obviously, drafting Joe Green. What is it, the 74 draft or the 73 draft, whatever it was, where they drafted like 4 Hall of Famers, getting Terry Bradshaw. I mean, over the course of the next 10, 11 years, the Steelers went from the laughing stock to maybe the model franchise. And then in the 80s, I think that there's a lot of people that have this misconception about the 80s for the Steelers. They didn't win Super Bowls, but they weren't the Falcons or the Jets or one of these really horrible franchises either. They got to the AFC title game at least once. They won some playoff games. They made the playoffs a few times. They had, some down years, but obviously, like everybody else, you move on from a Hall of Fame franchise-type quarterback, there's usually going to be a little bit of a growing pain that goes with it. Then they hired Bill Cowher, late 80s. Early 90s, whatever it was. He had an immediate impact. The team was built in a way that they, we were able to play great defense. They had the right sort of combination of quarterback and defense and Neil O'Donnell. And they were able to have some success early in the 90s again. But if you look at the Steelers overall, from 1969, 1970 to now, I mean, they've been the model franchise in the NFL, if you think about it. The Patriots obviously had that run from like 2000 to 2022 or whatever, where they were probably the greatest dynasty in many ways that we've ever seen. Forget about the Super Bowls and Super Bowl championships. I mean, I think they went 6, but they got to 9 of them in that stretch. And if I'm not mistaken, they played in like 12 or 13 or 14 AFC title games. So it wasn't just they're winning divisions. It wasn't just that they were winning playoff games, even years that they weren't winning the Super Bowl. And quite frankly, they're 2 miracle plays away from the Giants from having 8 Super Bowl wins and 1 loss, which is absolutely incredible. The Eagles were better than them when they beat them, but the two losses to the Giants, really 1 miracle play in both games, basically is the reason that they don't have 8 Super Bowls. But prior to that, they were pretty much a non-factor. I know they got to the Super Bowl the year they got destroyed by the Bears. That's one of the years that all of the Dan Marino fans don't ever want to talk about. But you know what? As bad as we talk about, certain players not winning certain games and all that other stuff, Dan Marino had a home game against Craig James and I think Tony Eason and company, a home game in the AFC title game, and lost it. And if you remember earlier in that year, they had beaten the Bears, and everybody was anticipating another Bears-Dolphins matchup. But, of course, the Dolphins fell short. That's why there's a number of games like that I always point to. I mean, I'll tell you another game that I thought that Dan Marino didn't come through for them. The year that the Steelers lost to the Chargers, the Alfred Papunu game. I mean, the game before that, Marino had plenty of opportunities to beat the Chargers, and he just didn't get it done. Including, just trying to throw a 5 or 8 or 10-yard pass to make that field goal at the end closer. So, but it's interesting if you take Marino out of the Dolphins, what we've seen for, as long since he's retired is they don't win playoff. They haven't won a playoff game since he's left. With the Bills after Jim Kelly, they didn't win a playoff game, until Josh Allen came along. So it's hard to replace a franchise quarterback. That's why I always laugh when people talk about the 80s as the dark ages for the Steelers. Really wasn't that horrible, all things considered. They had the Bubby Brister, Yes We Can year. Do you remember that? They had the year they went to the AFC title game, I think, with Mark Malone. They had a couple of other playoff, appearances or whatever. It wasn't like they were 3-13, every single season. That just wasn't the case. So, obviously Art Rooney, I think, is a beloved figure in Pittsburgh for a very important reason. He is responsible for bringing the Steelers to Pittsburgh. And so, and most people's vantage point of the Steelers, unless you're really old, is that they've been one of the best franchises in football. I mean, seriously, if you're, my age, I'm 55 years old. I was born in 1970. I mean, I don't ever recall the Steelers not being, one of the best teams. Even they've had a few down years here and there, but for the most part, I don't really recall, or I can't really come to, I can't come to like a conclusion that they were ever one of the worst franchises, because they've never been that. We've never in the last 50 years with the Steelers, 55 years, at least in my lifetime, seen a stretch of like 10 years where they were, 3-13 or 4-12 and awful every single year. We've never seen that. We've seen that with some of these other franchises, but we've never seen that with the Steelers. Now, if you're a little older than me, say you're 70, when you were growing up, the Steelers were awful. But the bottom line is most people choose to just sort of forget that part of it. And I think that's part of why, Art Rooney is so beloved here in Pittsburgh. He built the Steelers. Again, he wasn't great owner for 30 or 35 or 40 years or whatever it was. But, once he got the right people in place, the Steelers have sort of been the model franchise. And I often talk about this. The model of stability is something that, was good for the Steelers and has worked for the Steelers on some levels. But I don't know if it's a model that's going to continue to work the way that football is now, the way that the NFL is now, the way that sports in general are now. I just don't feel like it's one of these things where that model can really probably go away in some ways from the standpoint of the Steelers need to be changing, ever changing. And we point to the head coach a lot, but it's true. Like this obsession with keeping the same head coach, because we've only had 3 since 1969. I think it's probably hurt the Steelers in recent years more than it's helped them. I think that when you look at it in its totality, I think that the Steelers' obsession with keeping Mike Tomlin around has been probably to their detriment in some ways. I think that's the one thing that I would tell you about the Rooneys and the way they do things and, the way that they run their operation. I think they need to rethink this idea that they have to just try and be stable, especially since throughout this run since 2010, since they lost to the Packers in the Super Bowl, we're talking 15 years, they have 3 playoff wins. And it's pretty bad when we can recite them off the top of our head. They beat Matt Moore and the Dolphins. If you remember that, Matt Moore was, I think it was actually Ryan Tannehill that was hurt. Whoever their quarterback was hurt, and Matt Moore was the guy, and the Steelers beat him. They have the Vontaze Perfect, Pac-Man Jones imploding game against the Bengals. And then they beat Alex Smith in one of the worst games I've ever watched out in Kansas City. I think it was 19-16 or 16-13 or some crap like that. Those are the 3 wins. And the thing about it is, through it all, we've had multiple coordinators on both sides of the ball. We've had a GM change. We've had multiple coaches move in and out. We've had different quarterbacks. We've had different personnel, different defenses, different players. The only constant we've had is Mike Tomlin. And so when all of his, supporters all want to basically say that, we're just being haters, I don't know that we are. Like the last 3 or 4 years, we're at a point where you can't blame anybody else but him. And so I think that's going to be, the thing that we talk about with the Steelers is how long are they going to hold out hope that this stability model is the way to go. It's good to be stable. It's good to not change coaches every 2 years. It's good to, I get all that. But at some point, you have to look at it and say, is it working? And I just don't think it. I just don't think it is anymore. I think it hurts them more than it helps them. And anytime you can say it hurts you more than it helps you, it's going to be good. It's one of these things where I just feel like it's going to be important, for the Steelers to really, if they don't win a playoff game this year, reevaluate that whole situation and figure it out. That's what I would tell you. One of the things that's very interesting to me is that if you read newspapers or articles, I think what we're starting to see about the Jalen Ramsey trade for Minkah Fitzpatrick is that both organizations kind of wanted to get rid of a problem child. Or at least a player or a child who basically, found a way to make themselves a pain in the ass in the locker room. And I think that's where we're at if you read this. It's one of these things that Jalen Ramsey with the Dolphins. And again, here's the thing about guys nowadays. They know they have all the power and all the cards they hold and all that, and they use it. And in Jalen Ramsey's case, according to the Sun Sentinel, there was a story in the Sun Sentinel about it. In Jalen Ramsey's case, he was just becoming a real pain in the locker room. He was basically not a very team-friendly guy, which if you've ever watched him play, I could have told you that. I didn't need to be in the locker room with him. I could have told you that. And the other thing is, because he was not a real team-friendly guy and because he was not happy with the Dolphins, he pulled the James Harrison, late to meetings, late to practices, just kind of a guy who wasn't a very team guy. And, the Dolphins decided, well, we need to add by subtracting. And on the Steelers' end, it sounds like, according to Mike Florio, that the Steelers and Minkah Fitzpatrick were starting to lose faith in each other a little bit. That Minkah Fitzpatrick, one of the things that we've read a lot about him is that he was not he was not always on board with what they wanted him to do on defense. He was not the best at communicating. The other part of it is, if you think about it, and this is according to Mike Florio, but it's true, Darius Slay's had knee injuries. You bring in Jalen Ramsey because you want an insurance policy, but I don't think he's an insurance policy. I think he starts at corner opposite Joey Porter, which makes you wonder what's going to happen with Darius Slay. Is he going to become a safety? Is he going to become a slot guy? Is he going to become a nickel guy? What is he going to do? But you're not going to bring a guy like Jalen Ramsey with that personality, with that skill set, even though he's older or whatever. You're not bringing a guy like him to come in and just sort of be a role player. Because the reality is you can find role players who aren't going to be a headache for you. And contrary to popular belief, I don't know that Mike Tomlin's great at handling headaches. I think he's kind of an enabler. I mean, I think when you look at Antonio Brown, people can say, well, look at what he was able to do with Antonio Brown. And then that's great. But never won anything with Antonio Brown. And Antonio Brown became such a pain in the rear end. There's guys like that played in that era that said if Mike Tomlin had reeled him in a little bit, they might have had a shot to win another Super Bowl or two. But the whole locker room was basically run almost to acquiesce to his nuttiness. And I think that's where, the disconnect always comes. When I look at that situation, I just basically say, you know what? It's not, I don't think it's a badge of honor that Mike Tomlin allowed Antonio Brown to be himself. I think at times he probably needed to reel him in. We've seen it with George Pickens. We've seen it with some other guys. The thing about Pickens that's disappointing is Mike Tomlin had him as a rookie. Like, he could have gotten that whole thing under control from day one. So now you bring a guy like Jalen Ramsey. And again, if you've watched him play, his coverage skills are not in question at all. He's a guy that you put him on a receiver, he'll cover. He's long, he's rangy, he's got all that stuff that you talk about. He's athletic. He's got great instincts for the ball. There's no question that the guy's got a skill set to be a really, really good player, even still. But you see these guys that are really, really good players who go through a couple of teams, and you ask yourself, why? Why does somebody with that skill set go through a few teams like that? You look at even a guy like Antonio Brown, he bounced around a little bit, and then people basically just said, it's not worth the trouble. But Jalen Ramsey on the field is also brash. He's also very cocky. He talks a lot of trash. Are we surprised that the Dolphins basically said, this is a guy who probably now is bad for our locker room, even though he might be a good player, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. You have to basically look at it, and you basically have to say, this was a trade where both teams, the Dolphins and the Steelers, unloaded what they thought was a headache or a problem in their locker room. Again, I don't believe that. I think Minkah Fitzpatrick, for the most part, was liked by most of his teammates. But, I think the one thing is he was constantly battling the coaching staff because he didn't like the way they were using him. And he didn't think they were using him correctly. And eventually that stuff starts to wear down a relationship to the point where I don't think that anybody involved really kind of wanted to be involved anymore. And so that's where I look at, this whole thing with Minkah Fitzpatrick. I don't know that he was a bad teammate, although some would argue if you just don't want to accept your role on a team, you're a bad teammate. But some would say maybe not. I think the thing with him was he was just a guy that was never going to be happy here. And it was like, well, let's move you back to Miami and hopefully you go there and maybe in that defense you'll find a role that you like and that, but we're not going to change what we're doing just because you're unhappy. I always think that's a big, big thing in my mind. A big thing. So I look at it from that standpoint and I say that I just don't think that people on the outside understand that these were two guys that the teams wanted to move on from. The teams wanted to move on from them. And so that's where I would tell you it's important to note that. And I think that sometimes trades happen that way, where two teams say, oh, well, we're going to make this deal. And it really is, you give us your problem, we'll give us yours. We'll give you our problem, you give us yours. And let's see if the change in venue and the change of scenery and the change of coaches and change of, schemes and all that other stuff, let's see if it helps either of them. But I do think that, I've heard a lot of people talk about Jalen Ramsey maybe going to safety or Jalen Ramsey maybe, being the slot guy. I have a hard time believing you're bringing a guy with Jalen Ramsey's skill set, and his mentality and sort of how he goes about his business. I have a hard time you're bringing that guy in to be a backup. It just doesn't add up for me. To not be the corner opposite Joey Porter Jr. In fact, even to the point where there might be some games where he, not Joey Porter Jr., is the guy that's watching the top receiver of the other team. I mean, that won't shock me either. Because I think what we've seen with Joey Porter Jr. is he might be better cast as a 2 than he is a 1. They're using him as a 1, and I think he did okay outside of his penalties. I think he did okay. But I don't know that he is a guy that's really a lockdown, shutdown guy either. So to me, don't be surprised if we see Darius Slay play the slot a little bit, and don't be surprised if we see him playing safety a little bit. And Jalen Ramsey is the guy that's a fixture at corner, because that's what you're not bringing that guy into your locker room unless you're willing to do that. So really, I think if Jalen Ramsey is the guy that we think he can be, at least the guy that he's been, or anywhere close to that, and Joey Porter Jr. cleans up a little, some of the stuff he does, getting penalties and stuff. I think, and the other thing is they've got to find a way to sort of replace Minkah Fitzpatrick. I don't think that's going to be that hard. Not that he wasn't a good player, but I think what they asked him to do, they can find someone to fill that role. But if Ramsey fills the role of second corner and they're able to fill the role of safety, I really think the defense can be really good this year, especially with Derek Harmon filling in on the defensive line. It's probably going to give them a little bit more depth. But more importantly, I think he's an explosive player who's going to be an impact player. I think it'll help against the run. I think really, if you look at it all, the Steelers probably have a chance to be pretty good on defense. But it all comes down to, who is Jalen Ramsey? What is he? What version of him are you getting? And that, to me, is always the biggest question. And if he comes here, is he going to be a pain in the rear end as well? Is he going to be late for meetings? Is he going to be late for practices? Is he going to be belly aching because he's not getting what he wants? That's a fair question based on his career. What's his skill set? It's a fair question based on his career as well. I think it's always going to be a question when you have an older player, what he's capable of and what his skill set is and everything else, because you know what? Father Time is undefeated. And I think when you look at it from the standpoint of, there we go. Sorry about that. I was getting ready to lose power. From the standpoint of at that position, those guys go downhill pretty quickly. I mean, we talk about Patrick Peterson a lot, and the Steelers got him, and everyone was really, really excited. And then guess what? We watched him play for a whole entire season and said, you know what, he needs to get on with his life's work because he's done. Not saying Jalen Ramsey's there. I'm just saying it happens quickly with corners. So we'll see. The Pirates again last night. Another we would call very uninspired performance by your Buccos against Kansas City. I mean, it's one thing, when you look at it, it's one thing to lose, to get swept, whatever, in Seattle, because Seattle's actually a good team, and it's hard to play out there or whatever. But when you get beat up by Kansas City, that's not good either. But where does that leave the Pirates? It leaves them at 38-54. If I'm not mistaken, when Donnie Kelly took over, they were 12-28. So basically, they are 26-26 under Donnie Kelly, which is far better than what they were under Derek Shelton. But I bring this up because I think people are bad at math. I have people that are actually trying to tell me that they think the Pirates can finish 500 or better. Again, let's do the math. They've played 92 games, which means there's 70 left. Donnie Kelly's 500 as a manager. Let's say, and I don't think he will, but let's say they continue to be 500 under Donnie Kelly, which means they go 35-35. Do you know where that leaves them? 73 wins. Okay? And so, really, for them to go even 500 with 70 wins left, okay, with 70 games left, for them to go 500, they're going to need to win 43 games. That's 43-27. Is there anybody out there that wants to believe that they're going to go 43-27? Give me a break, will you please? They're not going to go 43-27 down the stretch. I don't think they're going to go 35-35, which means they're going to have less than 73 wins. I mean, even if they go like 33-37, which is very realistic, we're talking about 71 wins. And I keep hearing about how great their pitching staff is, and their pitching is good. But guess what happens when you have really good pitching for a while, and then all of a sudden you're not hitting. All of a sudden you start losing games. You know what happens? Honestly, your pitching starts to fall apart. They start to spring a little bit of a leak because it's just not realistic, other than Paul Skeens, to believe that the rest of these guys are going to continue to pitch at the clip that they pitched for the last 6 or 8 weeks. It's just not going to happen. And then you're going to start to see, okay, well, if that's not going to happen, then now what, if they can't hit and their pitching falls apart, where does that leave them? And let's not even go here, but what if they decide to unload some guys at the All-Star break? I mean, the most depressing thing about the Pirates isn't that they're losing. It's not. It's not that they're not that, good or whatever. It's not that they don't hit great or whatever. It's that when you look at their team and you look at their statistics, outside of Nick Gonzalez, pretty much all of their best hitters are old guys or guys like O'Neal Cruz. I mean, if you look at the guys that play all the time, right? It's not young guys. It's not, this guy here is who we're excited about because of the future and all this good stuff. Nick Gonzalez, and by the way, Nick Gonzalez has started to come back to earth too. I mean, I think he's a good hitter. But, he's slashing at 283, 339, 442. I'll be surprised if it's that high by the end of it. But nevertheless, your next three best hitters, McCutchen, Cruz, and Reynolds. And I got news for you. Cruz, who was inherited by, he was a Huntington guy, by the way. But Cruz is actually trending down towards becoming an under 700 OPS guy. You look at it that way and you're like, what are they doing? But McCutchen and Reynolds are old. Brian Hayes isn't young. Like, where are all these new guys? Where are all these prospects? Where are all these players that give you hope for the future? They don't exist. That's the problem. I keep hearing, they'll bring up some guy. Oh, this guy is the guy, or this guy. I actually had somebody suggesting they should bring up Jack Sawinski again. Why? We've seen it how many times? 6 years of hoarding prospects, and your best players or your best hitters, your best guys that are taking the field are guys like Horowitz and Pham and, Brian Reynolds and McCutcheon, these old guys. That's the most depressing thing about the Pirates. Anyway, game's always on at Archie's. Get down to Archie's on Carson Street, Archie's, home of 80-cent wings. Archie's is the home of the Paul Zeise grilled cheese sandwich as well. So get down to Archie's, and when you're there, say hello to Archie for us. Until such time, we're going to do it again tomorrow. We will continue to jump into some Steelers topics and everything else. But until such time, enjoy your day.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.